Hello and welcome to the Lotus Eater's first away mission into the Star Trek universe. I'm John and I'll be your host for today. I may not be wearing a red shirt today, but as the junior and suspiciously recent crew addition to this podcast, I don't fancy my chances. If it is my fate to suffer the withering disruptor fire of outrageous criticism, then I'll see you all in Stover Core. A bit of background to start with, we're going to be focusing almost exclusively on Star Trek The Next Generation today. This may seem like a strange place to start. Why not start at the beginning with the original series? Well, the original series started airing in 1968, a time when, as far as I'm aware, most of our viewers weren't even born. It's enjoyed today through the eyes of people who know they are watching a historical classic and not received in real time through TV broadcast as part of the weekly evening routine. The Next Generation, on the other hand, spans that critical period from 1987 to 1994, the golden age of broadcast TV, when many of our viewers were alive and watching it. So, while we will be referencing the original series in places, the focus of this discussion is The Next Generation. I'm joined today by Carl, or
Hello.
Captain Carl, for this podcast.
Don't think I've been promoted yet.
Have you seen The Next Generation?
I have seen, I think, practically every episode of The Next Generation. Multiple times.
Did you watch it live when it was all coming out?
Yes, it was on Sky One every evening when you were eating your dinner or after you'd finished your dinner.
Yeah, so
yeah.
And for many years after its first broadcast period as well.
Literally decades.
Yeah. So, spoiler warnings for the following episodes: Encounter at Farpoint, The Neutral Zone, Drumhead, Chain of Command Part 2, and The Road Not Taken. Now, without further ado, let's talk Trek. So let's jump right into it. Carl, how political is Star Trek?
At the time, when we were living under the liberal 90s consensus, it didn't feel very political at all. Because it wasn't pushing any moral boundaries. It was actually a very effective way of solidifying liberal morality, and it wasn't controversial. It didn't offend the senses, as it were. It was actually, it felt surprisingly apolitical, but of course now it's a deeply political show that pays no attention to people's skin color and gender.
So do you think that the political nature of it are as a result of modern political changes and not the environment it was made in? So you would say it wasn't a consciously political show?
No, I know it was. I know that Gene Roddenberry was creating a consciously political show, but it was very much in tune with the zeitgeist of the era. You know, this is what people wanted. This is the kind of future that looked like the best future that we could have had from the circumstances in which we found ourselves. And I think it was something of an ideal that people looked up to, in fact, in many ways.
It's definitely an idealistic show.
Very much.
And an upbeat show, you would say?
Yeah, it's positive. It's very morally informed, but not patronizing or browbeating. There are quite a few high moral questions that are answered in Star Trek in a sensitive way, actually. And I think that's probably one of the reasons it was so well received and so successful. It didn't patronize the audience. It assumed that you had a brain and you were capable of moral calculus. And it did represent the alternative argument that it was essentially rebutting. So I've got very many positive thoughts on Star Trek, actually.
Well, that's very... No, same. I mean, the reason that we're talking about this even is because it is this massive cultural phenomenon, and I certainly loved it as a child and continue to do so.
But the fact that it was political, but not offensively so, I think is rare. It's hard to strike that balance.
Yes, I think so. Would you say it was a philosophical show?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there's a deep amount of, again, Roddenberry's sort of liberal idealism that underpinned it. And then going back in the 60s when things were a lot more retrograde, I guess we would say. But come the sort of Next Generation in the 80s and 90s, these were settled axioms of social life. You know, people agreed, well, hang on, what difference does an interracial kiss make? What difference does it make if someone's gay? That's not like the issue that I care about. And I don't think people should be judged for those things. And Star Trek just incorporated those assumptions into mankind exploring the galaxy. And I think it felt very satisfying to everyone. So this is the future that I would like. People aren't enervated Kumas who just sit in the pod and eat the bugs and wear the VR all day. They're actually out doing something heroic and great, exploring the galaxy, and so they
Well, one might argue that it's a very small proportion of the population of the Federation which is actually doing this heroic exploring.
Sure, but the sort of teleology of mankind is there, and the people who aren't doing that are represented as basically doing what they like. They're living the lives they seem to want to live. Whether that's a fair representation of what it would be like or not, who knows? There's a big question. But the as an idealistic end future for mankind, as sort of like where mankind could arrive in a few hundred years, it looked pretty good, better than the alternative dystopian fantasies that came out of Hollywood in the in other ways. Like you've got the Demolition Man dystopias and things like that, Escape from New York and all of these more realistic fantasies about what
grittier and darker,
but also in tune with the social forces of the time, because we're actually seeing a lot of what they were predicting now, I think. And so Star Trek was a pleasant daydream.
A pleasant daydream. I think that's a good introduction. So it has a philosophy and it has a politics, and we're saying that this philosophy and politics were consistent with the civilization that produced it, late 80s, early 90s America.
And not just America, I think the English-speaking world.
Right.
I think the general attitude was that of, well, the civilization feels secure. We've just won the Cold War. We can be proud of ourselves. And therefore, this looks like a sensible and fair future. That was the thing. It looked fair. Whereas now, after 30 years nearly on from Star Trek, and more actually in parts, it's obvious that our civilizations are under attack. They're not secure. And so the consensus that underpinned the assumptions of Star Trek doesn't actually hold now.
So another question which I'd like to put to you. So there are a few points raised at various junctures in the Star Trek series which compare the Federation to the Borg. So for people the two men and a dog watching this who are unaware, the Borg were a
sort of biomechanical empire that incorporated all life forms into the state of being that was to be a Borg, and that's to have massive amounts of cybernetic implants and then losing all sense of individuality and becoming subsumed completely into the collective.
Yes, so they would basically encounter foreign species and life forms, and they would transform them into more Borg. So they would be changed from what we would consider mammals, individuals, aliens, people, into drones of a eusocial collective, like a beehive or a wasp's nest. Which is explicitly made through the introduction of the Borg Queen later on. But, so this is the Borg, and there are comparisons made between the Federation and the Borg, because both of them are empires, star empires. Both of them have this way of doing things and this view of what it is to exist. And both of them seem very, very keen on bringing everyone inside their own club. So what do you think about that comparison?
They both have an incorporative aspect. And the Federation attempts to incorporate cultures into its abstract and quite thin principles of liberal governance, as in these aren't cultural principles. These are essentially a form of game theory, where it's if we all agree to the certain set of rules, then we can all live comfortably and peacefully with one another. And so that's as far as the comparison goes, in my opinion, because the Borg expressly erase identity and incorporate it into a single Borg identity, whereas the Federation is multicultural, when being multicultural wasn't an evil thing. It has the prime directive. It doesn't just, in a predatory manner, go around stripping planets of resources and, absorbing the biological matter of, inferior civilizations and things like that. And it's got a kind of political incorporation rather than a sort of cultural incorporation. And so I don't think it's fair. I think the Federation is better than the Borg, and they have a set of ethics that determines their interactions with foreign species, and other foreign species still maintain their cultures even while working with the Federation, like the Vulcans or the Klingons or whoever. When they go into a partnership with the Federation, they still have their own identifiable cultures, whereas of course with the Borg, no one does.
Right. That's, I think, a very good point. It does often remind me when you hear this argument, when people play the relativist card and say, oh, well, America's no better than the Soviet Union or North Korea or communist China because they all do bad things and this sort of thing.
And that there is definitely a sort of analogy between Star Trek being America and the Borg being the Soviet Union, without a doubt. And to say one isn't better than the other, well, I think they are. I think it's demonstrable. And I think if you were given the choice, you'd choose to live under the Federation rather than the Borg.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've talked a bit about philosophy and politics, and viewers will probably be aware that there are a lot of people who like to claim Star Trek as their own. And one of the particularly interesting claims is that Star Trek and the Federation is a socialist utopia. So they have various arguments for this. Can we play the first clip, John?
That's what all this is about. A lot has changed in the past 300 years. People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We have eliminated hunger, want, the need for possessions. We've grown out of our infancy.
So this clip is very often used.
Yes.
And it illustrates, I think, quite well the post-scarcity society of the Federation. Money is abolished. Everything you need for everyday subsistence can be replicated by a machine at the touch of a button. Is this a socialist utopia?
No, but it is one aspect of what the socialists want in their utopia. The thing that I think distinguishes Star Trek from being a socialist, or I guess what we say communist utopia really, is the fact that it's hierarchical, it's meritocratic, and it has governing structures. These are all things that wouldn't exist in communism as fantasized about by communists. So the fact that the people are not atomized, they actually have concerns and relations between one another. There's a captain, the first mate, and they have personal relationships and things like this. These are all not indicative of what the communists are aiming for in the end. And there is private property in Star Trek as well. Picard's family owns a vineyard. There are various people who own like bars and things like that. Sisko's dad owned a bar or something like that. There is private property, and so it's not ideologically socialist, as in there hasn't been a deliberate and conscious effort to abolish private ownership of means of production. That clip did sound like something like a socialist would say. But also, I think it's not true either. They do still accumulate things, and Picard's got a bunch of things.
His ships in bottles, for example.
Exactly. They're things of personal or sort of cultural significance rather than material significance, because as he is, the premise of the thing is, we can just replicate anything we need, but that then is reflected in the things that Picard tries to collect, like the old statues. There's some ancient statue of I don't know, some native culture or something that he's got, and he's got it in his quarters. And so, well, why do you have that? Well, it's got sort of emotional resonance with you. It's significant because of where it came from, not because it can't be mass produced. It's unique. It's one of a kind. You can't ever get another one. And so that becomes significant. And I think we're seeing that now, actually, in the consequence of mass production, as in, I don't care about like this, this, I can just buy another one if I need to. However, when my son draws me a picture or something, I can't just get another one, and so that goes on the fridge. That this sentimentality attached to objects is what is demonstrated in Star Trek, and I think it is what we're beginning to see, because it's just the natural consequence of having access to almost anything at any time. If it's mass produced, then it's not special. If it's interchangeable, then it's not unique. And if it's not unique, then why would I have any attachment to it at all? But don't get me wrong, I think that's a fair criticism of the Gordon Gekko mentality of the 80s.
Right.
And this is coming out of that. And there were lots of Hollywood movie makers who, like John Carpenter in They Live, he says basically the same thing. He's like, look, I'm for capitalism, but like, what are we doing? We're going. I don't think greed is good. That sort of, and that's, I think that on a very human level, on a materialistic level, that's totally false. Greed is the best thing you can do to accumulate as much as you want. But he's appealing to something that's not materialistic there, which I think is interesting, because it's never expressly formulated that actually there's a kind of human ideal that underpins all of this, that is not something you can measure. And this, I think, is important. And I think a lot of the 90s, in fact, was about raging against the sort of the corporate structure that was a kind of anti-human bureaucratic or system of structures. that in my childhood, when I was like a teenager, it was always about not selling out to the man, right? It was always about not just taking corporate money to be a shill, because you lost your authenticity if you did that. You're not authentically artistic, if you're doing it for the money. And you should be doing it in spite of not making money if you're not making money. And if you make money by holding true to whatever your principles are, good for you, obviously.
Absolutely.
But this is what Picard, I think, is actually appealing to. That ethos there is what he's appealing to, rather than the sort of socialist, you're not allowed to earn anything because that creates inequality. There's inequality in Star Trek. Yeah. It's just not economic inequality because it's in a post-scarcity society.
And let's keep that in mind, because the next question I want to ask, thinking about the personal possessions and the personal value attached to these, even though they may be replaceable, is that there are no nations and no borders on Earth in Star Trek. And this is often cited as another big reason why it's a socialist or communist utopia. They've got rid of nations and borders. Isn't that great?
But they haven't actually, though.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.